Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. There is a lot going on with Gaza at the moment and some big new horrifying plans from Israel to settle permanently in Gaza and take it all over. That's at least what the Prime Minister's office in Israel is putting out, and Trump seems to be giving the green light to this idea. We're going to dive into all of this, as well as the humanitarian situation as it's currently evolving, with our amazing guest today. Beside me is Sal Takahashi, a Japanese human rights lawyer and professor with extensive experience on the subject matter, serving as the former deputy head of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, also having worked with Amnesty International and as Japan's representative for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And again, his work focuses heavily on Palestine and occupied territory. So, Mr. Takahashi, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'm very well, thanks.
What do you make of this plan that was recently announced? And it seems to not be surprising a lot of people now, but Israel is reportedly planning to completely take over indefinitely the Gaza Strip.
Well, like you say, it's not a surprise at all. I mean, basically, this is really in line with what they have been doing, not only since October 7th, 2023, but basically since 1948. You know, really the whole driving force, or the whole sort of main principle of the state of Israel, has always been kicking Palestinians out by force or by hook or by crook, and taking over their land and distributing that amongst themselves. That's the whole Zionist project. So this isn't a surprise at all. And already from, you know, a very early stage, from October 2023, I mean, there was already information about these kind of plans coming from Israeli government sources. They were reported in the media. And of course, very high-ranking Israeli politicians as well have been saying from the get-go that, you know, we should just kick all the Palestinians out and just, you know, re-colonize the land. So, you know, it's not a surprise at all. It's of course, not having, you know, having said that, it's not a surprise. Of course, it's always shocking when you know, anybody just sort of openly states that their objective here is ethnic cleansing, and you know, it's just sort of flouting international law and any kind of laws of morality just in the face. So, you know, that's still very shocking, but it's hardly a surprise. And you know, I think all of us who have been looking at what's been going on and following the situation, I don't think there are too many people being surprised right now.
Do you think there's going to be any sort of increased pressure from the international community, from business interests who aren't already opposed to what is going on in Gaza with the Israeli genocide, if Israel does in fact plan to move forward with a permanent occupation?
Well, I mean, whether it moves forward with permanent occupation or not, I mean, you know, one of the defining features of this latest overt stage of genocide since October 7, 2023 is the, you know, dismal lack of action on the part of most countries and of the quote unquote international community as a whole. So that's, you know, that's been one of the, you know, really outrageous features of this. Now, that having been said, you know, there is movement in many, there are lots of movement towards Israel accountable for its violations of international law. And it's, you know, it's not just NGOs and not just civil society. I mean, the UN in particular, the International Court of Justice, of course, has issued several opinions and also judgments on what's been going on related to, you know, the situation since October 2023. So that's one thing. But also the UN General Assembly last year in welcoming the latest International Court of Justice opinion on the occupation of Palestinian land by Israel. So last year, September, the General Assembly adopted a resolution basically ordering Israel to evacuate Palestine by a year's time. So that's September this year. They've been instructed basically to end the occupation, to evacuate the colonial settlements that they have constructed, dotted all over the West Bank, and to pay the Palestinian people reparations. Now, nobody thinks this is going to happen, obviously, and certainly the Israelis are just laughing at this prospect. But if you look at the language in this resolution, and frankly, if you look at the history of what's happened to, in particular, the other apartheid state, South Africa, in the 70s, I think what's really, what we really have to look at and see is will the member states put their money where their mouth is? But there is a very strong possibility that Israel will be basically expelled from the United Nations. Either de jure, well, that's probably too much to hope for, because that would have to go through the Security Council. But de facto, there's a way of doing this, basically suspending their participation in the General Assembly, which means that they are, out. So, that's something which I think there's a pretty good chance of happening, and there's a very good chance of happening, I think. So, we have to see, like I said, will the member states really put their money where their mouth is? They've, in general, been pretty reticent to do it up till now. But, when push comes to shove, when things get really this bad, I think there's going to be little choice but to take some kind of firm action. And I certainly hope that they do.
What impacts would that have on Israel? Would they even care if they were suspended from the or kicked out of the United Nations?
UN, yeah. Well, probably they wouldn't, or at least they'd act like they wouldn't. But this is going to lead to all sorts of different forms of isolation, and that's basically how it worked in South Africa, in the South African case. It wasn't just the sanctions and everything, that with the isolation that they experienced within the hallways of the United Nations, but it was it's all sorts of forms of economic sanctions, embargoes on weapons sales. Basically, it would come to the point where they weren't even invited to the Olympics. And, no country really can sustain itself in that kind of form of isolation. Not so necessarily that it would, collapse economically, but, all states crave for a certain measure of legitimacy. They want to be seen as legitimate players, as good global citizens. And no state really can survive as when it's recognized as a rogue state. It's very, very difficult to do that. With apartheid South Africa, it was essentially excluded from the UN General Assembly in 1974. So it took 20 years. It was a long time. It took 20 years for the South Africans finally to buckle under all sorts of sanctions, under all sorts of civilian-led boycotts and that kind of thing. It took them 20 years, but they finally did buckle. And we don't want to wait 20 years. We hope that it happens now. We want it to happen yesterday, of course. But the point is that it will happen. It will definitely happen. They might scoff at it, they might laugh at it at first, but soon it's going to bite. One thing that I remember from my days in living in Palestine is that I would have. Some of my best friends are Israelis. I'm sort of joking, but I had Israeli acquaintances and Israeli friends, and it was kind of difficult. They knew I worked for the UN, and it was kind of difficult to avoid, the subject. And I think we always ended up talking about it. And sometimes I tell them, look, I remember there was this young couple. They lived in the flat underneath. Anyway, they were talking about traveling to Europe. And I told them, look, you better travel as much as you can now, because sooner or later, your passport's going to be a worthless scrap of paper. You're not going to be able to go anywhere. And they were really shocked. They were stunned by this, I felt a little bit guilty because they're kind of nice people. But, it was this kind of thing really does hurt. And not only if you're, the head of a state, or the, the head of government, the prime minister and the former minister of defense, they basically can't travel anywhere except the United States and other non-parties to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So, yeah, they could go to China, and so, there are a few states that they can go to. But this is detrimental, to say the least, to the work of a head of government. I mean, it really calls into question the entire legitimacy of their whole operation. So, they laugh at this and they say, yeah, it's not a big deal, and we don't need them and that kind of thing. But the fact is, they do. Israel's a very small country in terms of population, in terms of GDP. They need international trade. They need international legitimacy. And I think the people in power in Israel are now, they're looking and saying, oh yeah, we have a sympathetic administration in the U.S. and the Americans are always going to be with us, and we know how to manipulate the American public and the Western Europeans. At the end of the day, they're always going to be with us. But they're wrong, and the writing is definitely on the wall. If you look at opinion polls in the United States, and especially amongst the young people, the younger generations, and that's really why Zionist forces within the U.S. That's why they've been so hard on clamping down on what's been happening in the universities. Obviously, much more than before since October 2023, but it's been this kind of thing has been going on for a while. For a while, we've seen professors being refused tenure, being shown the door because of their activities on Palestine. We've seen these, Zionist organizations prancing around campus and making a lot of trouble for faculty and staff that try to advance Palestinian rights. So this has been going on for a long time, and they do this because they see that they basically lost the battle. So the only thing they can think of is brute force. And that's what's going on. But we're definitely, the writing is on the wall, and we are heading for a very dramatic isolation of the state of Israel, sanctions, economic sanctions, those kind of things. It's definitely going to happen, and I certainly hope it happens soon.
What period of time or years did you live in Palestine, and were you both in the West Bank and in Gaza?
I was there from 2009, March 2009 through May 2014. Wow. I lived in Jerusalem. Yeah, it was 5 years, and it was a life-changing experience, of course, in many ways, as you can imagine. And that's obviously I had a lot of privilege as a UN civil servant. I mean, we had an office in Gaza, so I did go pretty frequently. To visit, and I would a couple of nights, every time I went to Gaza, and of course traveled around the West Bank a lot. The main office was in Ramallah, which is where the Palestinian Authority is located, so I did quite a lot of work there, and it was an amazing job to have as a human rights lawyer, and it was, of course, frustrating and very dejecting in some ways, because it's very difficult to make progress. But it's important. I mean, it's extremely important. All those reports and all those statements and everything that we made, and we'd be ignored by the Israelis. They would they even refused to talk with us for a couple of years. I remember when I was there. I mean, literally, like, we would call them and they'd just be like, oh, we can't talk with you, and they'd hang up the phone. But all those reports and that accumulation of documentation of the violations that Israel has been committing nonstop, those are being cited in international judicial fora, International Court of Justice. They've been used as documentation for the International Criminal Courts, arrest warrants. So all this kind of thing. It does lead to something, and I certainly, it's some of my colleagues got very dejected and left feeling that they were the sort of career in human rights, just that it wasn't fruitful. But we were part of something bigger than ourselves, and I think people like you and all of us doing pro-Palestinian stuff, it's still the case. We're part of a movement that's definitely bigger than each one of us. So we just got to keep on doing it.
One thing I'll never forget, I was in Yemen maybe 2 months ago, and there was a Chinese professor and journalist there with us who had lived in Gaza for a number of years,
Right.
working for Xinhua, and
Mhm.
there was a Israeli, well, an American jet plane flown by Israeli, or no, it was an American. The Americans were bombing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it flew over, dropped a bomb about a half kilometer away, and instantly he knew what sort of plane it was by the sound it made and when it
Sure.
dropped the bomb. I'm
Sure.
like,
Sure.
that's crazy. A journalist
Yeah.
shouldn't really know that stuff, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe a veteran, but I'm curious when you were there and you were visiting Gaza. Um, and in the West Bank, I've seen so many UN, workers and journalists who have been killed, who have been injured. Of course, post October of 2023, when you were there, though, did you have any close calls? Did you see any? I'm sure, this sort of carnage and devastation close to where you were.
Well, I wouldn't say that I had really close calls. It was more, certainly when I was there, the Israelis were a little bit more, I would say, circumspect, at least in the West Bank. In Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
it's always been, I mean, obviously, nothing compares with what we've been seeing since October 2023. But in Gaza, it's always been much more severe and brutal what they've been doing. In the West Bank, it was more sort of bureaucratic, foot dragging and obstruction. It was more the colonial settlers that one had to be careful of. I think one of our cars, I remember, they started throwing stones at us, and having rocks thrown at your car. It's actually quite a big deal if you're driving at like 80 kilometers an hour, as you can
Yeah.
imagine. So that was fine. Of course, I've witnessed stuff, not so much it happening before my eyes, but we would go. Our job was basically to go and document violations and document cases. I remember one case where so the Israelis had come in the middle of the night to assassinate this guy. They started throwing what are they called, sound grenades that make these huge flashbangs. They make these huge noises and smoke, and
Mm-hmm.
it's to sort of confuse people. And this was like in the middle of I think it was 3 a.m, if I remember correctly. And so he and his wife were in the bedroom, and the IDF, according to all the information that we gathered and according to all the testimony, so they were in their bedroom, middle of the night, and all of a sudden these huge noises outside of the bedroom. There was this sort of small sort of foyer in front of the bedroom, and anyway, so they call for him to come out with his hands up, and so he walks out with his hands up. And he walks out, and instantly, zap! They blow him away. So they killed him. They shot him in the head. These were very experienced snipers that the Israelis were using. Anyway, they're right there. It was a distance of like, I don't know, 4 meters, 5 meters, something like that. So he obviously falls on the ground. His wife is there, and she's going crazy. She's crying, and half of his head is brains all over the place and everything. And one of the IDF soldiers walked up. The guy, half of his head is gone. I mean, he's history. But the IDF soldier walks up and pumps in another 2 or 3 rounds in his body, just because. And that's the kind of gratuitous cruelty that I saw a lot of. And I remember, that day. So one of their daughters was, I think, 4 or 5, something like that. And she walks up to me. We were there, and I guess we had left the house, and we were sort of outside, sort of, talking with each other, me and the other colleagues. Anyway, so the daughter comes up to us with one of these old Nokia candy bar phones, and she's like, smiling, and says, "This is a picture of my daddy. This is a picture of my daddy." And half his head is gone. But she was like, the kid didn't understand what was going on. The kid, she couldn't imagine. You can't imagine these kind of things. When you're that kind of age, your father is blown, half of his head is blown away. And so that kind of thing, of course, you see a lot, and you can't help but see a lot. And that's, That's one of the things about Palestine, is that it's difficult to sort of imagine, maybe a little bit less now since October 2023, because everybody's been watching this live streamed genocide. But until then, it was sort of difficult to imagine. And people think of, military checkpoints and restrictions on travel and this kind of thing. And it's people can look at it and think, well, that's not such a big deal. I mean, I have traffic jams when I go to work. It takes me a couple of hours, dumb stuff like that. But people are inclined to think that kind of thing. But when you go, you see what's happening, and there's no mistake. I mean, really, there's no mistake in seeing, apartheid right in front of your eyes. One of my colleagues said it very well. He was a different agency, but he said it very well. He said, look, we're all international civil servants, so we always have to, maintain the appearance of impartiality and neutrality, and we must always be careful that we're not, we don't open ourselves to accusations of bias, blah, blah, blah. But he goes on to say, if after 2 weeks here, you're still impartial in your heart, well, there's something wrong with you. And though his words really stick with me, because it was very apt, very true. I mean, and even 2 weeks was too long. I mean, you're there for a week, you see what's happening, you can see apartheid, and it's just so in your face that you can't deny it. You can't deny it. And that's what really, one of the things that's really outrageous. I mean, you have, the so-called political leaders in a lot of Western countries just sort of poo-pooing it. A lot of the mainstream media they're in shackles. I've given up counting the number of articles and even UN statements that you see where, it's like a humanitarian disaster and people are starving to death and attacks on hospitals. And the word Israel doesn't even appear until like the last paragraph,
Yeah.
It's like, we call it in Palestine, we call it like the disappearing subject of the sentence, the disappearing word of Israel. But it's, this is the outrageous thing. Israel is not, should not enjoy this kind of impunity. They've enjoyed it for decades, but it's high time that it stopped. They have to be held accountable for the violations that they continue to commit.
How do you think this court case against Israel, well, there's the ICJ, there's the ICC. How do you think this is going to proceed? I mean, you don't really need it anymore, but we do have the serial numbers of all the bombs. We have the videos of the Israeli fighter jets. We have more proof than we could ever need. Of course, you have Israel, who's now drone striking Freedom Flotilla aid ships that were headed for Gaza. I mean, it's crazy, the level of escalation that we've seen since even the start of these court cases. How does Israel even manage to defend themselves? I understand they've scored a delay in the court case, but what do you think the outcome of this will be?
Well, the outcome of the ICJ case, the International Court of Justice case, I think is pretty darn clear. I mean, there's just no way that they can find that there hasn't been genocide. There are all sorts of legal maneuvers and legal acrobatics that can take place, but I think certainly already in the provisional orders that we've seen, they've shown themselves, the judges have shown themselves to be pretty much on the ball, that they can see what's going on. I certainly hope, for the sake of international institutions and international justice, and frankly for all of us, that they will find that Israel is guilty of committing genocide. I certainly hope that, and I certainly hope it happens, as soon as possible. The International Criminal Court, of course, these arrest warrants are there. They're not going to go away. They're not going to disappear. There's no time limit for these. That, like I said before, that hampers the work of people like Netanyahu. And I certainly hope more arrest warrants are going to be forthcoming. Again, a lot of people, sort of dismiss these arrest warrants and say, yeah, but they're never going to be arrested. They're never going to see justice. What's the whole point? But look, things can change, but it's happened in countries up till now where, all of a sudden the politics change and they decide that the best way to, regain international legitimacy is actually to hand over, these former honchos to The Hague. So that, that definitely could happen. But it's also, important to stress that it's not just these international efforts that we see. There are a lot of efforts taking place on the national level too, in a lot of different countries. And there are NGOs, civil society organizations that have dedicated themselves to collecting all the evidence against, even really sort of rank and file Israeli soldiers, because these idiots think it's a great idea to post on social media their war crimes. I mean, I call them idiots, but really what it is just because they're so used to impunity. They're so used to never being held to account for these crimes. They think, yeah, it's not a problem. It's going to be fine. But it's not fine because these are on the internet. They're not going to, you delete them from your Instagram account, but they're still, you can still get these things. I don't know exactly how it's done technically, but once it's on the internet, it doesn't go away. And so there are organizations that are filing arrest warrants, or that is requests for arrest warrants, judicial actions against individual soldiers when they're traveling abroad. And this has been going on in several Latin American countries and in European countries. And and a lot of these soldiers have had to turn tail and run away from, cut their holidays short. What a disaster. But cut their holidays short and split. And some of them have even had to do so with the assistance of the Israeli government. So, it's starting. I mean, these universal jurisdiction things, they're not going to go away. And, like I said to my friends, I gather they're not watching now, but, the sooner or later, their passports are going to be scraps of paper, or they're going to be so afraid of traveling anywhere that they're not going to be able to do it. Interestingly, there was something posted on social media. I have to stress that I don't know if this really took place, but I wouldn't be surprised that a Japanese sort of guest house in Kyoto, our old capital, that when an Israeli tried to check in, that he was asked to sign a declaration that he had not committed any war crimes in Gaza. And, he put it on social media and make it a big deal. I don't know if he signed the declaration. I guess not. I guess he stormed out in protest. I don't know what he did. But, that's the level that this is going towards. I mean, this is where we are. We're looking at international isolation. We're looking at, soon there will be economic sanctions. Soon, major businesses will just not want to have anything to do with Israel. And that's really the point of these things. It's you look at the BDS movement, the boycott movement, boycott of Israel. And, a lot of the Israelis like to scoff at it and they poo-poo. They say, but, look, our economy is booming. That was before, we're talking before 2023, of course, but our economy is booming. We're doing just fine. And, these boycott, it's just a joke. But it's not so much about dollars and cents. I mean, it is about money in the first instance, but it's about legitimacy. It's about international legitimacy and creating an atmosphere where businesses will look at you and say, yeah, but we can't do business with Israel. I mean, that's just beyond the pale. No, that's just no, we can't do that. And that's happening. That's already happening. So, it's not happening again as quickly as we would like. We want it to happen yesterday, but this whole movement is definitely moving and it's moving forward. So, it's the writing is on the wall, and it's just a matter of time.
Well, Saul Takahashi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Very, very, very insightful breakdowns, and I really enjoyed hearing about your experiences in Gaza and in the West Bank. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, people just stop listening when they see a translation or a subtitle from someone, a video of someone speaking from Gaza. But your experiences as a veteran official of the United Nations and several other organizations. I think hopefully will reach many more people who somehow haven't already woken up to exactly what is going on, as you say, and are somehow still, impartial to the facts and their heart. So thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people follow along with you on social media or anywhere you might write if they want to stay up to date with your work?
This is one of those things that I'm not so great at, unfortunately. I do have a website that I made with one of those sort of free providers, but I haven't really been keeping it up to date. There's a Japanese website. It's in English, but so don't worry about that. But it's made for researchers in Japan to sort of highlight their work and to do sort of like exchanges with researchers in other countries, and that's called researchmap.jp. So that's maybe that's a good way to sort of check up on me and see what I've been doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.